Hello and welcome to 15-Minute English Lessons, the channel where we teach you some English in 15 minutes. Today we are going to be looking at the poem Ozymandias by Percy Shelley, husband of Mary Shelley, who of course wrote Frankenstein, and good friend of Lord Byron, who wrote other things. The poem was first published in 1818, thank you Wikipedia, and Shelley wrote this in friendly competition with someone called Horace, because of course he did. I mean, have you ever heard a more Cambridge University private school story than that? Apparently, Shelley's literary circle used to set each other challenges of writing sonnets on different topics just to see if they could do it. Ho ho ho, what fun they must have had. Okay, let's have a look at some of the key words you might need to know. Sonnet, hubris, iambic pentameter, frame narrative, and Ramses II. Let's talk about Ramses II then. Who is he? What do you need to know about him? Well, nothing really, not for this poem anyway. He was an Egyptian leader from like a million years ago or something, and in Greek his name was Ozymandias. Here's a statue of him, or at least a bit of one, that was very famous around the whole world and almost certainly inspired the poem, and somehow, definitely fairly and definitely legally, ended up in the British Museum. He was a big old deal. He was hugely important when he was alive and did a lot of stuff, but most of you probably won't have heard of him, or at least be able to name the things he did, and that's sort of the point. Shelley wanted to write something about man's desire, okay, I mean, it could be man or woman, but let's be honest, it's man, for power and glory and importance in inverted commas, which eventually, with time, will just be forgotten. Now, we all know of people who seem obsessed with their legacies and their importance on earth, and they're imbued with a certain kind of arrogance, and that's because they have huge amounts of hubris. Thanks for this definition, literarydevices.net, a character trait that features excessive pride or inflated self-confidence, to the point where, when those warnings that we all get from the world come around, they ignore it, they choose to ignore it. So as you can see, it's basically massive arrogance in the face of divine warnings or moral laws. The most famous real-world case that you've probably heard of is the Titanic. Now, did it sink because James Cameron can't write dialogue? No. I mean, he can't, but that's not why it sank. Neither is hubris necessarily, but before Titanic set sail in 1912, it was advertised as being an unsinkable ship. Now, if you believe in this kind of thing, shouting from the rooftops about how nothing on God's earth can sink your ship does make it feel a bit inevitable that it's going to sink on its maiden voyage, doesn't it? Titanic is often cited as evidence of man's hubris, but it can apply to individuals too. If you ever see a video on social media of anyone on a skateboard saying, "Dude, check this out, it's going to be awesome," well, you already know how it's going to end. Lots and lots of fictional stories throughout history have talked about hubris. TV shows, fables, movies, books, the rest. You have the story of the tortoise and the hare down here, very famously, about the hare's arrogance in the face of the tortoise's persistence, and the rest you may be familiar with as well. That's Victor Frankenstein in the middle there with, I guess, his monster? Anyway, the point being that men, or a rabbit, I guess, in that first story, who are so focused on consolidating wealth and power and building an empire that they think will make them immortal, that they forget, A, to be good people, and B, that they are up against something they can't beat, nature, the most powerful force of all, whether it's time or death or nature or the universe or God. Obviously, that all depends on your particular beliefs, but it's the most powerful force. The point being is that human beings crave control, but we simply can't have it. At least not at the level where we can control the random events of time. Some of these people are fictional, some of them are real. History is full of people with hubris, and they are lessons to us all. It's not just these guys. There have been plenty of military leaders who decided they were too impressive to adhere to the laws that we mere mortals have to follow. Hitler, Stalin, Genghis Khan, Napoleon, Caesar, etc., etc. And then there's more modern examples, whether it's drug cheat Lance Armstrong, corrupt politician number one Richard Nixon, convicted sexual predator Harvey Weinstein, not quite convicted yet sexual predator and Cheeto-fingered daughter fancier Donald Trump, or even the Greta Thunberg bothering answer to the question, what if someone who spent his early career getting his head kicked in tried to give moral advice to people while running a sex trafficking ring? Andrew Tate. So, hubris. Anyway, let's have a look at the poem, shall we? Okay, so the first thing that we're going to mention is that this is what we call a framed narrative. The poem starts with our narrator, presumably Shelley himself, saying that he has met a traveller from an antique land. Bear in mind, this is the early 1800s, so travelling like people do today would have been impossible to even imagine, let alone do. So that gives the poem not only a narrative, which is demonstrated by the speech marks that begin on the second line and continue all the way through to the end, but it also gives the poem a sense of exoticism, something far away and from a different world, sort of like the Greek myths of people like Icarus and Narcissus, or the state of Wyoming. Basically, the important thing here is that we are hearing this story secondhand from Shelley, but he's hearing it secondhand from the person who saw the statue. So it's almost been passed down, almost like legend would be. Okay, let's get into the form of the poem. It's a sonnet. Now, sonnets are 14 lines long and in iambic pentameter. If you're not confident in iambic pentameter, you can check out our video on that very subject, so in 15 minutes you will be. But unlike traditional Shakespearean sonnets, this is not about love, and the rhyme scheme is a little bit erratic, and it doesn't end with a couplet. Now, you have to remember in analysing poetry, especially short poems like this, you have to be able to say something about the things that you've noticed. So I can tell you that the last 2 lines don't rhyme, but anybody can tell you that. So we have to try and think, okay, can we analyse this? Nothing in poetry is an accident, and I know that's such an English teacher thing to say, and there's all the memes on the internet about how, when the author said the curtains were blue, what did he really mean? And English teachers lose their mind. And that's true, but poetry, when you're an accomplished poet like Shelley, you've only got 14 lines to write your ideas. You're going to make that, you're going to have to make that good. And so you can't afford accidents. So could it be that the rhyme scheme is erratic and incomplete because the story and the statue are incomplete and mysterious? Well, maybe. But remember, we don't know what Shelley was thinking. So if you're going to speculate, it should be a sensible speculation. But he's chosen to alter this rhyme scheme for some reason. So let's have another look at it. You would expect what we call an ABAB rhyme scheme in a sonnet. You might also expect what's called an octet and a sestet, clearly defined, clearly delineated. That tends to happen in Elizabethan or Shakespearean or Petrarchan sonnets. But it doesn't happen here. Here, lines 1 and 3 do rhyme, but so does line 5, which you wouldn't normally get. Lines 2 and 4 are meant to rhyme. I mean, they don't, but it's close enough. But then we never see this rhyme again in the poem. Then you have lines 6 and 8, which also rhyme, but line 7 doesn't rhyme with line 9, but it does rhyme with line 10. So that's unusual. Then we have a traditional kind of quartet of rhymes, which at the end, despair, decay, bear, away, fine. But there's also appear, which rhymes with despair and bear, which makes you think that maybe the rhymes are coming in 3s, except only 2 rhymes do come in 3s. So the thing is, when it comes to things like a rhyme scheme, like I say, anybody can tell me that land and sand rhyme with each other. So the question is why? Well, traditionally in sonnets, one of the reasons that English teachers can remember the prologue of Romeo and Juliet so well is because it's a sonnet and because it rhymes, which means when you get to the end of one line, you kind of know how the next one has to end because it has to rhyme. And of course, if you were going to deliver a sonnet to your paramour in the Elizabethan times, it would help if you could remember it, because otherwise you'd look like an idiot. So maybe the rhyme scheme makes poems easier to remember, and maybe this one makes the poem slightly harder to remember, like the dynasty of Ozymandias himself, possibly. Okay, this is the trickiest 3 lines in the poem, I think, in terms of the key images. The rest is relatively straightforward, but what you have to do here and what you have to remember with all poetry is don't read to the end of a line. Read to the end of a sentence. There's good recordings of this poem, and I'm going to recommend one to you later on, but let's have a closer look at these 3 lines. Okay, so if Shelley was writing in prose, this is what it would have looked like. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that it sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. It's a complicated clause. Actually, stamped on these lifeless things is a subordinate clause which breaks up the sentence. If you add that to the unusual layout because of it being a poem, it's quite tricky to get a meaning of it. But apart from that, here's what it actually means. What he's saying is that the work of the sculptor has actually, ironically, survived the work of Ozymandias. What we can see here from this statue is not that Ozymandias was a great king and a fantastic leader. What we can see is the sculptor was a really good one. And so that's another irony of the hubris of Ozymandias having this statue built of himself to celebrate his glory, whereas actually all we know for sure is that the sculptor who did it was very good at his job. So apart from that, the poem's quite easy to follow. So what else can we say about it? Well, let's have a look at possible double meanings. Here we see Ozymandias' hubris. He's anointed himself king of kings. And on one hand, that's impressive because he says, look on my works, which at the time would probably have been quite intimidating when you could see them. But now there's nothing left of what he did. And this might give us another way of looking at the statement, almost as if to say, this is all that's left. After everything I did, this is all that's left. Look at it and despair, because one day this is all that will be left of you too. The original statement is surely meant to say, despair because you will never achieve what I did. And remember, he did achieve an awful lot. But it seems now more like despair because even all the things I did, even my works and achievements, are just sand now. This could be a reference to the fact that nothing else is left except this ruined statue. It could be that nothing beside the statue is still there, nothing beside except remains, where once there would have been testament to his great achievements, or it could be a standalone statement. What are his work? Nothing but remains. All right, let's look at the semantic field of destruction or loss here. It's not a huge semantic field, but then it's not a long poem. When you're identifying things like a semantic field, try and think about the connotations of what you're talking about. Remember, saying there's a semantic field of destruction with words like decay and wreck just isn't enough. Decay has connotations of something that's slowly reduced to nothingness, but it's also a word that brings images of something unhealthy, something rotten, something that's decomposing. And this is all that's left of his giant empire. Wreck has connotations not just of something that doesn't exist anymore, but something that's been ruined or destroyed carelessly and left behind by the world. The fact that it's colossal, not just big, suggests the scale of the devastation, which emphasizes and highlights the meaninglessness of Ozymandias' achievements. And the last two lines are a beautiful way of saying that there is nothing as far as the eye can see. Nature is still here. After centuries of disruption and change, the sands are still level, stretching into the distance, whereas Ozymandias, who thought he had control of all this, is half sunk. Those of you who've watched Breaking Bad will know there's an episode called Ozymandias. It's in the final season, and it's regarded as one of the best episodes of TV ever made, and that's up to you to decide. But certainly in trailing the episode, the producers got Bryan Cranston to read in character as Walter White the poem. And you can find it quite easily. It's on YouTube, and I highly recommend. I was going to play it to you here, but for some reason the sound won't work. But I highly recommend checking it out and listening to it. He really imbues it with that kind of the same arrogance and the same anger and the same kind of righteous fury that you can imagine Ozymandias may have had. And it, of course, is talking about the same thing his character is going to suffer, which is the taking your eye off the ball and not paying attention to the little things. Trying to just consolidate your empire is going to cause problems and eventually will fade to nothing. The futility of life is really well explored in that episode. So, what's the point of the poem? Well, I don't know. Shelley wasn't a friend of mine and I can't ask him now, but I think, given that people who are much more intelligent than me have been analysing this poem for a couple of centuries, I'm going to take it that they know what they're talking about. The nature of power and the power of nature, but mostly the first one. Power can be held, but it can't be kept forever. And people have described this poem as something that should be considered a lesson to tyrants, a warning to us all that no matter how grand our achievements, in time they will fade and mean nothing. But Shelley doesn't give us an opposing view. It sort of feels to me like, especially in this modern world, there should be something like, okay, building a tower with your name on it won't necessarily make you a great person, Donald, but if you live your life with the right values and the right moral compass, Donald, then you could be considered a great person and your legacy will live on through your children and their children. There's none of that here at all. This one is up to us. We're just left to contemplate the giant nothingness that stretches out ahead of us like a traveller from an antique land. Yay! Okay, that's it for this video. If you've got any questions or you would like more detail on the poem, please leave a comment. If you liked the video or didn't like the video and all that, etc., 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 please leave a comment and please subscribe and do all the subscribey things that YouTube channels ask you to do, if that's all right. Honestly, it doesn't matter to me that much. Even if I end up with 6 billion subscribers, eventually around the decay of the colossal wreck of my teaching channel, the lone and level sands will still stretch far away. All the best, everybody. See you in the next video. Bye-bye.